In Luke, we'll be in Luke 23, and there's only 2 chapters left. We got 3 weeks before the end of the year, so we're going to get through this. Now, the upside for me about this is that while most of you at church are going through your Advent season, we get to really think about what the real purpose of the coming of Christ was. You know, I told you last week, and I know not many people watched last week's video, and that's okay. I mean, Sherry didn't even watch it. But Christmas to me is we have the focus wrong. We start celebrating Christmas in like July, right? But we spend about 30 minutes celebrating Easter. And Easter for the church is actually the point of transition, because it was on the cross that Jesus nullified the contract of sin, and it was in the resurrection that he gives us the power to live the Christian life. And we still are hung up on the baby in the manger, like the puppies in the kennel in there. They're so cute and lovable. But really, the effectiveness of the puppies is when they grow up and they do their job. The effectiveness of the Christ was his sacrifice and resurrection. And so I struggle with Christmas. I always have. And there's a whole thing around the Christmas mythology that irritates the life out of me. And the point is, I'm glad we're going through this part of Luke now. So when you go and do your Advent at church, you'll be thinking this will be in the back of your mind. Okay? So we're going to back up just a little bit into I'm going to give you an overview of chapter 22. Jesus is arrested, is betrayed by Judas in verse 47, and he gets arrested. Now, you may have heard all your life that there were 3 trials and 2 of them were illegal after Jesus' arrest. That's not exactly accurate. The first 2 inquiries, and I've got them on the board behind me, and you don't have to write them down, but the first one was at Annas' house. Actually, it was Annas was Caiaphas' father-in-law. And Annas, the Romans came to Annas and they said, you have too much power, you can't be the high priest anymore. And so he was the power behind the throne. The next 5 high priests were all related to him. And so when he goes to Annas, and Annas is questioning him, and Jesus said, well, I don't have to talk to something like, I don't have to talk to you because you're not the high priest. And somebody slapped him and says, how dare you talk to the high priest that way? And Jesus goes, didn't realize I was. Because he wasn't technically the high priest, but everybody treated him that way. So later on, he goes before Caiaphas, who is the high priest. And they're bringing witnesses, and they're all lying and making stuff up. And finally, 2 of them agree and say, we heard him say that he could destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And Caiaphas said, what are you, God? And Jesus said, well, that's what you said. Well, he just claimed to be God. That's blasphemy. Okay. So then the next morning, they take him, and you see in verse 66 of Luke chapter 22, it says, when it was day, the council of the elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, if you're the Christ, tell us. That's the trial. Because it's the Sanhedrin, it's the scribes, it's the whole people, and it's in the daytime. Not trying to rock any boats or anything, but I want you to understand the other 2, they didn't consider trials. They were just fact-finding. What do we call them today? Well, what do we call them today in Congress when everybody sits around and doesn't say anything? Excuse me, Mr. Mayorkas, can you tell us how many people crossed the border last weekend? I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't have those figures before me. You don't have a clue? I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't have those figures before me. This kind of thing. And what did Jesus say when they were asking him all these questions? Nothing. He didn't answer them at all. They were beating him to a pulp. They were doing all kinds of stuff to him. And you can see that in verses 63 through 65 of Luke 22. The men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him, and they were asking him to say, prophesy, who hit you? And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. So we've had the trials before the Jews. The Jews had rules. The rules were very specific. But we told you, as I told you 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Jews had set out to kill him. They didn't care. They were going to kill him. That was their plan. They just needed a reason. So tonight we're going to talk about his inquisition or his trials before the Romans. So there's going to be two guys that he's going to go to trial before. You all know about Pilate. And then Herod, that we're going to talk about in a minute, is the same Herod that killed John the Baptist. So we're kind of keeping this all in the same ballpark. Now, what do you know about Pilate?
Roman.
He was a consummate politician. He was a cavalry soldier who had a protector in the Roman court. And so he became the prefect of Jerusalem. And he did whatever he had to do as a politician to keep his job. Ultimately, Pilate was killed. No, Pilate had to kill himself by the order of Caligula because he was arrested and taken to Rome for killing a person without giving them a trial. He was just a politician, and you'll see that tonight. He's a politician. What is a politician's primary job? To get reelected. No, that is their primary job. And they will say whatever is necessary and do whatever is necessary to keep their constituents happy enough to get them reelected. That's their primary job. It is not looking out for your best interest. What was Pilate's job? This prefect job was pretty cushy. He got to order the soldiers around. He got to live in palaces, eat good food, all kinds of stuff. Get away with all kinds of stuff. So that was his job. So they have, at the end of chapter 22, they have this trial. They said, okay, we've got him on blasphemy. Let's take him to the Romans. They took him to the Romans. Why'd they take him to the Romans? The Jews couldn't kill him. The Romans had to. And to this day, if you ask the Jews, did they kill Jesus? They will say, nope, the Romans did that. They will tell you that because that's technically true. It's legalistically true. The Romans did it. So here we go. Verse 23. Chapter 23. Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king? Where's blasphemy in there? What? That's not the charge that they arrested him on. There are actually three charges. The first charge is being a revolutionary. We found this man to be misleading our nation. Now, when they released Barabbas later, what was Barabbas accused of?
Murder.
And insurrection. That's a word we throw around in our culture today, isn't it? Well, that's what they're accusing Jesus of, is being an insurrectionist. He's throwing all of Judea into a turmoil, and even Galilee. And so, where did this charge come from? What was Pilate?
Politician.
And what did a politician need to hear? Buzzwords. We need to have buzzwords. Hashtags today. Hashtag insurrectionist. Hashtag January 6th. We need to have those words. Well, that's what they're doing here. Things don't change. If you believe people have changed or over time, they don't. People are the same. The only thing that changes people is when God transforms them through the power of the Holy Spirit. But people are fundamentally the same. They have been forever and ever. So the first thing they charge him with is insurrection. And the second thing is, and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. He's going to subvert your government. He's going to get our nation to stop paying taxes, and then you guys are going to have to come in here and close us down. Now, is that what you know from Scripture? What did you hear in Scripture? When the Jews when the Jews asked him if they should pay taxes, what did he say? Yeah, but how did that happen? He asked them, he said, show me a coin. And somebody gave him a coin, and he says, whose picture is this? Well, it's Caesar's. Well, give Caesar's his stuff and give God his stuff. But where did this come from? Again, these are the words that were inflaming or intending to inflame the politicians and the crowds. Be careful, because this is exactly what the 24-hour news agencies are doing. Be careful. They want you to be upset, because if you're upset, you'll watch, you'll engage. Be careful. And the last one, very simply, is that he was the king and not Caesar. Oh my gosh. Caesar is a god. There's no other king but Caesar. I'm telling you right now, nobody can be king. And this Jesus is saying he's a king? Now, Pilate isn't stupid. He didn't get to be where he's at by being gullible. Okay? He was a cavalry soldier, so he'd been in war. When they brought Jesus to him, what did he look like?
He was disfigured.
They'd been punching him in the face. They'd been pulling on his beard. They've been, so he's bloodied and swollen and doesn't look much like a king to anybody. So Pilate's going, what's going on here? Now, let me ask you a question. Who's making these charges? The Jews, right? The high priests. What is one of the themes that we keep seeing in the book of Luke? Is the corruption in the church. The corruption in the church. And these guys are willing to do whatever is necessary to violate the law in order to preserve their system. And what made them so angry to do that? Because this is an intentional murder. This is not a justifiable homicide. This is intentional murder. This is first-degree murder. What made them so angry to do that?
Started taking your money for extra money.
When he cleared the temple and he said, my Father's house will not be a den of iniquity, but it will be a house of prayer. Remember that? And he threw over the money changers' tables, and we went all through that. When he attacked their money, they decided that was it. We're going to kill this guy. But they were the church. The sixth commandment. You shall not kill. And they were like, that doesn't apply to us. We need to be careful. I want you to see how the Jews treated him in light of how the Romans treated him. You remember I told you that people don't change? The groups of people don't change. So Pilate asked him, verse 3, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered and said, that's what you say. He didn't say yes or no. He just said, what do you think? And what does Pilate say? Verse 4. What's another way of saying that? I find no grounds, or I find no guilt in this man. Let's make it, he's what?
Innocent.
There you go. That's the word you're looking for. He's innocent. The Jews were saying he's guilty, he's guilty, he's guilty. The Romans who didn't have a dog in this fight went, no, he's not. And this wasn't an idiot. This was a well-seasoned politician. He goes, why are you here? And what do? They kept on insisting, saying he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. He's doing this under your nose, and you're not doing anything about it. But look at what verse 5 says. They kept on insisting. They weren't going to let this politician weasel out. Now, there's a much longer version of this story in Matthew 27 and John 18. And when Jesus first gets brought before Pilate, Pilate's wife has had a dream and said, don't touch this man. He's innocent. And Pilate tried to do everything he could to keep Jesus from being killed. How come the Jews were so persistent in wanting Jesus dead?
He was messing up their livelihood.
No. Sherry said because he was messing up their livelihood. No. Why were they so persistent? Because God wanted Jesus to die. It's real easy for us to blame the Jews. But this was God's plan, and Jesus had to go to the cross. He couldn't get let off. And I believe just as God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he wouldn't let the people leave Egypt, I believe that God was working in the hearts of these people saying, he's got to die. He's got to die. Isaiah 55 tells us that God was pleased to crush Jesus so that he might become the penalty for our sin. Pleased to crush him. So be careful when you read into this that the Jews are trying to kill Jesus. No, this is God's plan. So when we evaluate what's going on in the world today, be very careful that you don't keep it down on an earthly level. Be very careful. God is playing chess and he's moving pieces as he needs to move them in order to bring us to his end. So when you look at the world, oh, Hamas invaded Israel, it's the end of all things. How many people do you hear say that? Is this the beginning of the end? And you hear people in church say it all the time, and you go, no, the temple hasn't been built. What? You got to read the Bible. But you got to stay back. You got to keep that 30,000 foot view and realize this isn't Hamas against Israel. This is God moving chess pieces around and using the evil in men's hearts to accomplish his purpose. So remember that. This is much bigger, and you have to change the way you think. So, but Pilate, he sees a way out. It's so cool. He again, he's smart. So when verse 6, when he heard it, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. So Pilate punts. He said, "Oh, this ain't my jurisdiction. I don't have to make this decision. I'm sending him to Herod." What do you know about Herod?
Yes.
Who was Herod's wife? Used to be the wife of his brother. And Pilate had more power than his brother, and he said, "I like your wife. I want her." And his brother said, "No." And he goes, "Oh, yeah?" He goes, "Okay, Herod, yeah." And Herod said, "I want your wife." And his brother goes, "Oh, you can't have her." And Herod goes, "Oh, yeah?" He goes, "Okay, you can have her." And so John the Baptist was preaching again. And the thing that made Herod upset was every time John the Baptist saw him, he said, "You know, it's against the law for you to be sleeping with your sister-in-law. You can't do that." And Herod goes, "What you talk about, Willis?" And so, what is it? Mark 6? I think it's Mark 6:14. Let me look. So Herod, let's switch over to Herod. That's the next thing on your list. Herod liked John. I think he liked John because John had no pretense. He didn't care. And when people came out to John the Baptist to get baptized, the priests and the scribes came out, he goes, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee the coming wrath? You bunch of snakes, what are you doing here?" I love John the Baptist. And, he didn't wear the right clothes. He didn't go to the right schools, but he was powerful. And verse 14 of Mark 6, and King Herod heard of it. He was talking about Jesus. For his name had become well known to him. The people were saying that John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others were saying he's Elijah, and others were saying he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he kept saying, "John, whom I beheaded, has risen." So Herod thought Jesus was John the Baptist, and Herod liked John the Baptist. And who got rid of John the Baptist? How did that happen? You got to understand, and I'm going to put this in pretty vernacular terms. So his Salome, his wife's daughter, did the old people called it the dance of the seven veils. She did a striptease for him. She wasn't very old. Teenage years, probably. And he liked it. He was pretty drunk and he liked it a lot. He said, hey, baby, I'll give you anything you want up to half of my kingdom. And so she goes to her mom because she's so young. She goes to her mom. She says, what do I ask for? And her mom said, John the Baptist's head. That's how much Salome's mom didn't like John the Baptist. This girl could have had half of Herod's kingdom. And her mom said, I want John the Baptist's head. Why? Because he kept calling out her sin. People don't like you calling out their sin. So Herod believed this guy was John the Baptist reincarnated. He didn't know. Now, here's the thing. Herod had been wanting to see Jesus for a while, but why hadn't he gone to see Jesus? Where had Jesus been? In the synagogues, out in the woods, visiting all the towns. Where did Herod stay? North of Richmond? Should we say that? He stayed in his little ivory tower above the people, not associating with them, but lording it over them, not knowing what was going on. But he kept hearing rumors about this Jesus, and in his mind, he thought it was John the Baptist risen. Okay, so verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Herod wanted a show. How many of us want the show? We want the show. We want to rub the magic genie lamp in prayer and poof, have all of our prayers answered the way we want them. We want the show. So be real careful about us saying Herod was a terrible person. He was just a person, and he was lost. And he didn't understand who God was. We need to be careful not to say, oh, it's easy for us to sit back in our armchair and say, this guy was terrible. He just wanted to see a show. How many people that followed Jesus wanted to see the show? John 6 is a classic example. He crosses over the Red Sea, and people are following after him. And he said, look, all you guys want is to have your stomach filled up again. He said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And the people are saying, well, what does that mean? I don't understand. It's a hard saying. And John 6:66, it's easy to remember, John 6:66. John 6:66 said, many of his disciples left him and stopped following him. Many. Not some. Many. Why? They were there for the show. How many of our church members are there for this show? They're not going to be there when it gets hard. And I don't mean they won't be in church. There are a lot of people who keep going to church even when church isn't a nice place to be. I'm talking about when it gets hard. There's a disease out there. You need to stay home because you might die. And go see Jesus? I'm not trying to be ugly here. It wasn't even a mandate from the government. It was a suggestion. And we closed down our churches, and 40% of our church members never came back. Across the board. 40%. Wow. When it gets hard, people leave. And I love John 6:67. You know what it doesn't say? And Jesus went after him. He turns to Peter and the others and goes, are you guys going to leave too? And Peter goes, where will we go? You alone have the words of life. Disciples stay when it gets hard. And this is hard. So Herod wanted to see a show. And verse 9, he questioned him at some length. And Jesus answered him nothing. So Herod wanted a show and he didn't get one. What do you think his response was? No. He made a show. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing of him. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Since he didn't get a show, he made him a spectacle. What do people do? If I can't destroy you, if you don't give me what I want, then I'm going to discredit you. This gorgeous purple robe, Jesus walked back in. That's where he got it from. It was Herod. Herod said, "You're not going to give me a show? I will give everybody else a show. Look at your face, swollen and bleeding, and how are you dressed? Like a king." Oh, these men had no idea who they were talking about. I wonder if any of us would recognize Jesus if he just showed up one day. We'd like to think we would, but maybe he's just different than what we think Jesus would be. I don't know. Verse 12 is an interesting verse. Luke is the only one who records this. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before that they had been enemies with each other. What makes enemies into friends?
A common enemy.
A common enemy. And who was the common enemy? No, it wasn't Jesus. Who else is in the picture? The Jews. Look again in verse 10. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him how? Vehemently. They had shown their true colors. They'd lost their control. They were out of their minds. And Herod and Pilate were standing around going, Did you see that high priest? Did you ever hear do y'all remember Tony Campolo? In the 80s, he was an evangelist that went around, and I loved him to death because he was like John the Baptist. He didn't care. And he said, I win arguments for 3 reasons. I get in your face. I'm loud and I spit when I talk. And I think the high priest's face was red, and the little vein was sticking out on his forehead, and there was spit coming out of his mouth. And I think these 2 Romans were going, "Did you see that guy? He's lost his crackers. He's around the bend." And I think these guys, that was the commonality that got these guys talking to each other and went, "Yeah, I don't know that there's anything wrong with this guy. He doesn't act like a guy, a normal criminal. He's not trying to defend himself, but those guys are out of their minds." So I think it was their common enemy or them both seeing the true nature of the Jews that made them go, Think about in our churches. What's one thing that would make everybody insane?
New carpet.
No. I'm not. I don't think that's it. But let's say the government. Let's say in most of our churches, let's say the government rescinds the Second Amendment. Then what? Or let's say that churches can no longer be tax exempt. Did you know that if your pastor from the pulpit ever endorses a particular political candidate, you can lose your tax exempt status, even if he does it once? And he says, "We should vote for Trump," you can lose your tax exempt status. Now you can say, this is what the Republicans stand for, and this is what the Democrats stand for, and you have to make a decision based on biblical norms. That's not against the rules. But if your pastor ever stands up in the pulpit and says, you should not vote for this candidate and you should vote for this candidate, you lose your tax exempt status. It's that simple. I went to a church before the last election. Not kidding. They put a wooden cutout of President Trump on the Lord's Supper table. And the pastor eulogized him for 20 minutes to the point where people in the audience were crying. And that was his sermon. They were so moved by the greatness of this man. And I'm like, that's against the rules. You can't do that. You can't take my tax-exempt status. I'm a church. You only have the tax-exempt status because the government says there are rules. What would happen if your church had to go back and pay in perpetuity all of its taxes? It's an interesting question. You can't do that. I'll spit and get that vein on my head. What would happen? What would it take for the people in the churches you go to reveal themselves? Sometimes that's all it takes, is the wrong person asking a question at the wrong time. And you see leadership just lose their cookies. And you go, that's what I've seen. That's the leadership of this church. And you have to be careful, because it's easy for us to point out these guys in the Old Testament, but we see glimpses of it now. What did I say earlier? People don't change. And when we have lost people in leadership of our church, just like we had selfish, greedy people running the temple, which was never God's plan. You see these people. You see the lostness come out. And I'm just telling you, be careful. It's easy for us to point back then, but we have to hold the mirror up to ourselves now. Okay? So verse 13. Well, I'm just going to say, I didn't put this on there, but Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. So verse 13. Back to Pilate. And we're almost done. Whew, we're going to get done early. I don't know how that happened. So back to Pilate. I cannot tell you how many times Pilate says he's not guilty, because I don't know. There are at least 3 times listed in this chapter. So Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and he said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you made against him. Nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, saying, Behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him." Both Herod and Pilate declared him innocent. And these are people that knew about Jesus, but they didn't have a dog in the fight. And they were like, why is he here? And these guys were so deluded because God wanted Jesus dead. So, Brother Pat, are you telling me that God uses the selfish, willful hearts of humanity in an evil sense to accomplish his purpose? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it'll take me a minute to find it. I've been struggling all of a sudden. I think it's in 2 Thessalonians. The Great Delusion. And I have to find it. I won't remember where it is. Maybe it's in 1 Thessalonians. No. Okay, I know it's in one of the Thessalonians. Anyway, what it says is, and I don't see it. Somebody will find it. Somebody look it up on their phone. The Great Delusion in Thessalonians. Basically what it says is that when we get to the end times, God's going to send a delusion on people who don't believe, so they can't believe, and they won't believe the truth. And you all are looking at me going, what does that mean? How many times have you watched a video where somebody said, I'm not trying to argue with you, these are facts. And they go, we don't know what facts are and you're a jerk. They can't see it. They can't hear it. They don't comprehend the simplicity of facts. And what is this? This is that delusion that God is sending on people. when you start looking at this, it's going to become more and more common. Okay, when we say that biological males don't belong in women's locker rooms, and people say, no, biological males can have babies. There was a lady who testified before Congress, and she said, if a transgender male, if a transgender woman, let's put it that way, that's what she said, believes enough they can have a baby. And somebody said, well, what about a uterus? And he goes, it doesn't matter. If they believe enough, they can have a baby. They don't understand facts. They can't see them. And we look at those and we go, what, you lost your mind? No, God is sending a delusion on people who don't believe, so they can't believe the truth. And when I see things like that, there are a lot of people who go, these people are insane. No, this is God letting a depraved person run to the end of their depravity so they can't see the truth anymore. Well, Brother Pat, that's not how it works. Go to Romans chapter 1.
The verse you were looking for?
Yes.
2 Thessalonians
Aha.
2, 11 and 12.
I was right. What's Thessalonians?
And now we're on to Romans.
Yeah, but let me just read this in, oh, there it is right there. It even says delusion in the margin of my Bible. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they will believe what is false, in order that they may be judged who did not believe in the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. God's going to send a delusion on them. So you guys need to be careful when you go, these guys have lost their minds. No, God has let them run to the end of their rope. So go to Romans 1. I'm going to start in verse 18. Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Unrighteousness is behavior, not belief, it's behavior. Because that which was known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. To whom? So everybody knows about God. One of the questions I always love to ask atheists when I run into them, they're like, you're a Christian, you're insane. How can you worship a God? I'm like, you don't believe in him, why does it make you so mad? I mean, if I worship Peter Pan, would you be mad? If God is make-believe, why are you mad? The only reason you're angry is because you know God is real. Because God put it where? What does it say in verse 19? Because that which is known about God is where? Is what? Evident where? What is this? Evident within them. So, for this reason, since the creation of the world, verse 20, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they, the unrighteous, are without excuse. For even though they knew God, not knew about him, even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanging the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore, look at verse 24. God gave them over in the lusts of their heart to impurity. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passions. For the women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. In the same way also men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire towards one another. Verse 29, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, evil, greed. What does the Bible say that God does with people who want to run away from him? He packs their suitcase and buys them a ticket. He doesn't just say, don't let the door hit you on the way out. He says, you want to go? I'll put you on the train so you can go all the way. And then when you come back and stand before me, you won't have an excuse because you knew me. because I packed your suitcase. So when you see these people today that have lost their minds and they can't see reason, why is that? Because God said, I've removed myself from within them. I've given them over. So when these priests were attacking, yelling and screaming about Jesus, what had God done? I'm going to use the evil that's in their heart to accomplish my plan. There's nothing outside of the bounds of God because God is in control of everything. Don't ever forget that. So let's go back to Luke chapter 23. So again, verse 13, Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and he said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I found no guilt in him. Verse 15, neither is Herod. Verse 16, therefore I will punish him and release him. I'm going to give you an option. I'm going to beat the fool out of this guy, and then I'm going to let him go. And what did they say? No. So what did Pilate do? He beat the fool out of him. And then he brought him back, and the people said, no. And they cried out together. So verse 17, now he's obliged to release them at the feast of prisoner. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they cried out all together, saying, away with this man, and release for us Barabbas. They knew Barabbas was a murderer. They knew that he was inciting the Jews to rebel against Caesar and Pilate and Herod. They knew that. And what would have happened if the Jews had rebelled against those guys? The Romans would have come in and crushed them. This absolutely destroyed them, which is what happened in 70 AD. Destroyed the entire city, just leveled to the ground because Roman had enough. And these people said, no, we want the murderer released. Put the perfect guy on the cross. How many of those people that were standing there yelling for the death of Jesus had been healed by Jesus? You ever think about that? What does John say at the end of his book? Well, I suppose if we wrote down everything that Jesus did, the world wouldn't contain the books. How many of those people yelling for the crucifixion had been healed by the touch of God? And God knew they were going to be there. And he healed them anyway. I don't understand God. Which is a good thing. If I was worshiping a God that I understood, he's not very much of a God. Because I don't have a very big mind. So, verse 18. But they cried out altogether, away with this man, and release us for us Barabbas. He was one who had been thrown into prison for insurrection made in the city and for murder. And Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. No, I don't want to kill him. But they kept on calling out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And I can't imagine the uproar as the chant got bigger and bigger. How many people? So Jerusalem on a normal day was about 20,000 people, but during Passover it had about 2 million in it. How many of these people were hollering in unison? Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And that it's reverberating off the walls, and the stones in the street are shaking, and Pilate is going, wow, what do I do? He's a consummate politician. What did he do? Verse 22. And he said to them a third time, why? What evil has this man done? I have found no guilt demanding death. Therefore I will punish and release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. How did we get to today where we have to use they, them pronouns and let biological males compete in women's athletics because they kept yelling louder and louder and louder. At first, the politicians said, no, 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 no. And they were louder and they were louder. And the politicians said, no, 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 no. And they were louder and they were louder. And finally, the politicians said, well, maybe. Well, maybe. Do you remember when Bill Clinton stood up and said that he was for the Defense of Marriage Act? That marriage was between one man and one woman? And then not a decade and a half later, he was like, no, no, I've changed my position. Why? Because the voices got louder and louder. And this is what politicians listen to, is the squeaky wheel. What would happen? And I asked, my granddaughter was, a few months ago, my granddaughter and I were sitting around talking, and she was listening to the news, and she was hearing about all of the black people that were getting killed by the police. And she said, this is terrible. And I said, have you looked at the numbers? And she said, what? I said, get on your phone and Google the number of unarmed shootings in the United States by nationality. And white people are killed on average twice as often as black people. And she goes, what? I don't understand. I says, because we don't stand up when one of ours gets killed and go, this is an injustice. What do? The idiot was probably doing something he shouldn't have been doing, and he got shot. She goes, then why? And I said, because the politicians listen to the squeaky wheels, and we don't squeak enough. So be careful.
Isn't it also, though, that God is moving us to the position that He wants us?
God is always moving, and that is the point.
That's what He was doing.
Yeah. Why is it that these people couldn't stop saying He's got to die? So be careful. And then we finish this up, and Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted, and he released the man that they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. So next week, we're going to talk about Jesus on the cross. And we're going to talk about what that substitutionary atonement meant. So as you go back on Sunday and they talk about the nativity, and you have the little mythological manger on your... It is mythological, because the wise men and the little drummer boy and all that didn't all happen at that point in time. The wise men showed up when Jesus was a child and he came to the house, not the manger. That's what the Bible says. When Jesus was a child and the wise men came to the house, it was probably closer to 2. That's why Herod killed everybody that was 3 and younger, because he had inquired what time the star had shone. Do you guys understand? And I've said this before, and it irritates the life out of me. I grew up in the church, and I grew up seeing the fact that Mary never broke a sweat when she had Jesus. It didn't hurt. She was like, oh, I'm pregnant. Oh, look, we have this child of God. Look, he's all clean. The little halo thing around her head. You know, the little drummer boy was going, doom, 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 right? No. Where were Mary's parents? By law, where were they? They were in Bethlehem. Why? Because they were the house of lineage of David. Where are Joseph's parents? They were in Bethlehem because they were the house and lineage of David. Why weren't they at the birth? How many of you, when your daughters were giving birth, did anything to be there? Their parents weren't there. Why? The answer is real simple if you just play it out in your head. No, it's not that. Okay, here it is. Okay, I'm going to come home, and the angel said, you're going to have a baby, and you're going to call his name Emmanuel, because he's going to be God with us. You're going to call his name Jesus. Oh, this is so great. And now I'm going to go home, and I'm going to say, Dad, I'm pregnant. And he's going to go, Joseph the father, No. So now you're an adulterer. She's an adulteress by law. And now she says, so what does he say? Well, if Joseph's not the father, who's the father? What's her answer? And what does that make her? A blasphemer. God has impregnated me. I've never been with a man, and I'm going to have the Son of God. And it was a much greater crime to be a blasphemer than it was to be an adulterer in her day. And you want to know why her parents weren't at the birth? Because they disowned her. They kicked her out because she was blaspheming. She would not tell anybody who got her pregnant. She kept saying, insisting in her insanity, that it was God that made her pregnant. And God doesn't do those things, does he? Women only get pregnant when they have relations with a man. That's the only way it's ever happened in the history of ever. And don't you ever talk to me like that again, girl. And why do you think God sent them to Egypt after the wise men came instead of sending them back home? Because they weren't welcome. Do you understand how hard this was for a girl that may have just been 14 or 15? Do you understand how hard it was for Joseph not to have the family connections to continue being a carpenter? Oh, you're with Joseph. You're with, Eli and Joseph and Sons, right? And then Eli went up and scratched Joseph's name off the sign. You don't belong in my house anymore. You're disowned. You see, these two people gave up everything in order to bring the king into the world. And we have so whitewashed it and made it mythical that it was all peaches and cream. I realized the other day, it blew my mind. The only Christmas story that gets it right is Frosty the Snowman. When he puts the hat on his head, what's the very first thing he says? Happy birthday. Happy birthday. He's the only one that gets it right. And we've bought into the marketing that the birth of Jesus was a beautiful and lovely thing. The boy was born in a first century parking garage, and it stunk of manure and wet straw. And the only people that attested to him showing up were the shepherds. And when they went to court, did you know that their testimony was only taken at half validity because they were such liars? Nobody believed shepherds. And when they went to court, their testimony was only taken at half value. Please, we have to put the Bible in the reality of where we find it. And Jesus didn't come to be born. He came to die for me. And he came to be resurrected so that as God's Spirit transforms me, I can walk in the power of the resurrection right through the gates of hell without fear. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you cannot look at the manger without seeing the cross. The bloodied, nasty, evil, cursed tree. Because if you look at the manger without seeing the cross, you've missed the entirety of the picture. And I'm telling you what, you watch your churches from now until Christmas, and they're going to sing those Christmas songs, and they're going to sing, and it's okay, as long as you remember these trials. And that stick that they wrapped his beard up in and pulled out, and those nails that they drove through his hands, and the fact that after they beat him senseless and put him on the cross, that the flies were already laying their eggs in his body while he was alive, and the guy who created those flies couldn't even swat them away. And he did that for us. Not that cute little baby in the swaddling clothes in the manger. The God-man who hung on the cross for me so that my sins were paid for. I don't earn anything in the manger, but I receive forgiveness on the cross, and I receive power through the resurrection. And we spend this much time celebrating Easter and this much time celebrating Christmas. It irritates the life out of me. This poor church of ours. Well, I've been on my soapbox long enough. Let's pray. Father, we come before you. And I humble myself, and I'm sorry if I get out of line. I get so irritated. Easter is the day we should celebrate. Your resurrection, your power over sin, your power over death, that you impute to us, those of us who believe on your name and walk in your way. Father, forgive us for being blinded and resigning ourselves to the comfortable and the beautiful when it was the horrible that paid our price. We do bless you and honor you, and we pray this in your name. Amen.